Following the Civil War, the United States of America is a mess. More than 600,000 Americans were dead. Half of the nation had been destroyed physically and decimated economically. And more than 4 million formerly enslaved individuals were now trying to find their place in a society that wasn't always welcoming. The process of trying to repair the damage that had been done and solve the problems that had created the war in the first place was known as Reconstruction. Let's take a look at it today. So what was Reconstruction? In short, it was the process by which the United States attempted to rebuild at the conclusion of the Civil War. This included readmitting Southern states back into the Union. The entire process lasted between 1865 and 1877, which, given the scope of the problems that the United States was facing, really wasn't that long of a period of time. No one can say for certain exactly what President Lincoln would have done during this time period had he lived, because of course he will not have the opportunity to lead the nation through Reconstruction. But we do know what he had proposed doing, which was a rather charitable plan toward the Southern states. He said that once 10% of the voters from the 1860 census were to swear an oath of allegiance to the United States, that state could be readmitted into the Union. Not everyone in Lincoln's party agreed with this, however. They felt it was too lenient. The so-called radical Republicans wanted to destroy the political power of the former slave owners, provide citizenship to African Americans, and in short, punish the South. Before the war even came to an end, steps were being taken to radically reimagine what the United States would look like going forward. Foremost among these was the 13th Amendment, which formally abolished slavery in the United States. But now that slavery was abolished, what was to become of the former slaves, now known as freedmen? To answer this question, Congress established the Freedmen Bureau. It was a temporary welfare agency designed to assist in the transition to freedom. The Bureau had lofty goals and limited successes, but one area where it was truly successful was in the field of education. Slaves were denied the right to learn to read and write, and now that they were free, many jumped at the opportunity to be educated, knowing that education would be key if they were to be successful in their new lives as free people. Across the South, schools were established to teach not just small children how to read and write, but also adults who wanted to have the power of education for the first time. Sadly, shortly after the establishment of the Freedmen's Bureau and the surrender of General Lee to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, President Lincoln was killed. John Wilkes Booth, a Southern sympathizer and well-known actor, killed Lincoln at Ford's Theater, setting into motion a series of events that would radically shape politics in the United States going forward. Replacing Lincoln was his vice president, Andrew Johnson, a man who, if anyone had ever imagined Lincoln might not survive his presidency, never would have been chosen to be the vice president. Why was this person put on the ticket in 1864? To broaden the appeal. Johnson had the unique place of being a Southern Democratic senator who, when his home state, Tennessee, seceded from the Union, Johnson remained loyal. For that, he is added to the ticket to broaden the appeal of Abraham Lincoln in 1864. This would send a signal to Democrats in the North, voters in border states like Kentucky, that Lincoln was a candidate for everyone. So Johnson might help bring some of those voters along. However, Lincoln and Johnson could not have been more different. While both were born very poor and worked their way to successful careers inside and outside of politics, that's where the similarities ended. Johnson was a drinker. He was racist. He did not believe that the country owed anything to former slaves. He identified with poor whites because he was one, and he resented the powerful Southern planter, the so-called planter aristocracy, for their role in hindering the economic opportunities for whites in the South. Now Johnson, a Democrat, is in charge of a largely Republican administration and a largely Republican government. Because the Southern states seceded and took most of the Democrats with them, Congress was overwhelmingly Republican. But even within Congress, there were two camps of Republicans, the so-called moderates, those who agreed with Lincoln on most things, and then the radicals, those who sought to punish the South and pursue equality for African Americans. While the Republicans in general are going to be a problem for Johnson, it is the radicals that are really going to ruin his presidency. In 1865, after Lincoln had died and Johnson became president, he began the process of quickly readmitting Southern states into the Union. All he required of these states was that they ratify the 13th Amendment, they repudiate debt, and they repeal their ordinance of secession. Once a state had done that, it was more or less welcomed back into the Union, according to President Johnson. The people he excluded from such charity were Confederate leaders and wealthy landowners, the planter aristocracy that he had resented so much. If they wanted to get their rights back and be allowed to participate politically, they had to apply for a personal pardon from the president, pardons that he more often than not was willing to give out. By December of 1865, according to President Johnson, most of the southern states had met all the requirements and were welcomed back into the Union. This was pretty shocking to Congress. They're equally surprised when they arrive in Washington to find that the southern states have elected state governments and elected members to Congress, including some former Confederates. Obviously, Congress was not going to tolerate this, and they began to make plans for their own version of Reconstruction. In early 1866, Congress passes the Civil Rights Act of 1866, designed to protect rights of African Americans and address the black codes, which were denying basic rights to recently freed slaves. Johnson vetoes this. He also vetoes a re-extension of the Freedmen's Bureau. President Johnson would go on to veto more pieces of legislation than any president to that point in history. In turn, Congress, controlled by Republicans, overturned more vetoes than any Congress in history. Congress began reasserting their authority, and this begins a process known as Congressional Reconstruction. One major aspect of Congressional Reconstruction was the 14th Amendment. Concerned at Johnson's hostility toward African American rights, and concerned that future Congresses may overturn any rights that might be granted to African Americans, Congress pushes through the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, setting in stone the ideas of citizenship for all individuals born in this country, aimed at African Americans, and establishing the concept of equal protection under the law, civil rights. Later, Congress establishes the Reconstruction Act of 1867, which President Johnson vetoed and they overturned, which divided the former Confederacy into military districts to be overseen by a Union general. Troops would be stationed in the South to protect the rights of formerly enslaved people. The tug of war between Congress and President Johnson went on for several more months. Concerned about Johnson's control of the executive branch, Congress passes the dubious Tenure of Office Act in 1867, which in short stated the president could not remove members of his cabinet without congressional approval. Johnson disagrees with this law. Congress is concerned that Johnson might try to fire one of their allies, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, a holdover from the Lincoln administration. Sure enough, Johnson fired Secretary Stanton. For this, the House of Representatives impeached Johnson. To impeach means to formally bring charges, and that is exactly what the House of Representatives did. However, according to the Constitution, charges are not enough to remove a president from office. The president must be found guilty by the Senate, where a trial will be held. 2/3 of senators are needed to remove a president from office. Johnson goes on trial, and by a single vote, he is acquitted. While Johnson may have survived the impeachment process, the presidency is certainly reduced as a result of this. Johnson spends the remainder of his time in office really as an ineffective and unimportant figure, and for the next 40 years, presidents are going to take a back seat to Congress. So what was life like in the South during Reconstruction? After all, it is the South that's being reconstructed in the first place. Well, by 1870, all of the former Confederate states have rejoined the Union. They've all ratified the 14th Amendment. That was required by Congress. And politically, you see the rise of the Republican Party in the South. Now, keep in mind that at this time, the Republican Party is the Northern Party. But in the South, the Republican Party, because of the disenfranchisement of former Confederates, because of the protecting of voting rights for African Americans, and because Northerners in many cases were moving to the South, the Republican Party is going to gain some prominence. Carpetbaggers, as they were known, were Northern Republicans who moved to the South to take advantage of the economically depressed area. Scalawags were Southerners who joined the Republican Party. They were viewed as traitors by whites in the South. Obviously, life for African Americans changed a tremendous amount as a result of the Civil War and Reconstruction. Many get very involved in politics, and some are even elected to state, local, and in some cases, federal office. Some former slaves and other free blacks were elected to office, including people like Hiram Revels, who was the first black senator. For those not involved in politics, agriculture is where they're primarily going to be working, just like they were before the war. The difference, of course, is they're not working as slaves, they're working as free people. But that doesn't mean that they're completely able to move up the political and social and economic ladder. Many find themselves as sharecroppers. A sharecropper is someone who works the land for a landlord, and as payment, they have to turn over a share of everything they produce, their crop. Thousands of former slaves find themselves working as sharecroppers, many of them on land owned by their former master. Many poor whites become sharecroppers as well. If you're giving away a tremendous amount of everything you produce, your ability to move up the economic ladder is tremendously hindered. There's also the passage of things called black codes. Black codes were laws designed to make sure that former slaves would remain a subservient labor force. Free blacks could be arrested and forced to work for white people. In some cases, they could even be sold. So while slavery is gone, and that's a wonderful thing, equality and the true blessings of liberty do not necessarily exist in the South for former slaves. In 1868, Andrew Johnson is not going to run for re-election, obviously. The Republican Party is going to nominate the most popular man in the North, Ulysses S. Grant, the victorious Union general from the Civil War. He's going to be elected because he enjoys broad support in the North, but also because 1868 was the first time that in a number of states, African American men are going to be able to vote, and they overwhelmingly support Grant. To make sure that state legislatures or future Congresses cannot interfere with this vote, Congress is going to push through the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, which protects the voting rights of African American men. It states that people cannot be denied the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Notably absent is denying people the right to vote based upon sex. This is why many women who had long been fighting for voting rights actually opposed the 15th Amendment, believing that if their rights were not guaranteed as well, they would have to wait a very long time until they had constitutional protections for their voting rights. It turned out they were right. Grant's Reconstruction policies are going to be summed up in the Enforcement Acts throughout the 1870 and 1871, which is going to uphold federal power in the South. One reason why continued federal presence in the South was necessary is because of the rising threat of the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK. The so-called Invisible Empire of the South was a secret terrorist organization. They were designed to make sure that free African Americans did not exercise their right to vote, did not advance economically. They're there to try to keep blacks in their place. Grant addresses this through some of these force acts that we mentioned earlier, in which he essentially launches a war on terror that targets Klan leaders, and he's pretty effective at it. Unfortunately, the KKK is largely successful in the fact that after Reconstruction ends, many of the things they were trying to achieve in the first place, preventing blacks from voting, making sure blacks did not have economic opportunities or equal education, are going to become standard in the South. Reconstruction is going to come to an end in 1877 for a number of reasons. Number one, Northerners get tired of paying for it. Maintaining a military presence in the South to protect the rights of blacks was getting expensive. Furthermore, the Supreme Court had turned against many of the policies that the radical Republicans had pushed through. The Freedmen's Bureau was allowed to expire. Many former Confederates are once again granted their right to vote and hold office. And slowly, federal troops are being withdrawn from the South, and as they are, the rights of African Americans are being put in danger. In 1876, there was a presidential election, and the outcome of that election was in dispute over a number of questionable electoral returns. And a commission was put together between Republicans and Democrats, and it appears that a deal was made, the so-called Compromise of 1877, in which the Republicans were allowed to win the presidency with their candidate, Rutherford B. Hayes, if they agreed to end Reconstruction policies, withdraw all the troops, and allow the Democratic Party to take control of state governments in the South again. And that's exactly what's going to happen after 1877. These so-called redeemers, these Democratic candidates who are swept into power after Reconstruction, begin the process of, they believe, redeeming the South and trying to undo many of the hard-fought victories of Reconstruction.